The Gulf War was an event that caused many shenanigans, controversies, conspiracies, and tragedies, committed under shaky pretenses and renowned for its even shakier aesthetics. The Gulf War narrowly fits into this category of conflict that is simultaneously really important, yet is boring as sin compared to other more dramatic wars in antiquity. It, however, did inspire some absolutely baller SNES games.
Не играл.
Also, we're talking about the
Что
OG
такое SNES? SNES я знаю, а SNES нет.
Gulf War. The one from the early 90s. Not the Iraq War, which some people call the Second Gulf War, and a lot of people believe was the Gulf War, when it was technically the second.
Да. Я напоминаю, что во времена Первой войны в заливе Советский Союз еще существовал. И он дипломатически поддерживал Соединенные Штаты. Другой вопрос, что если Советский Союз был настроен на то, чтобы как-то более аккуратно отнестись к вопросу, что ли, американцы такие, мы будем хуярить. Мы будем хуярить, и всем пизда.
По 80 рублей, сатанизм.
Мы их всех демократизируем, даже если им это не понравится. Рано или поздно они согласятся. Спасибо за деньгу.
About the original Gulf War, which took place from 1990 to 1991. Soldiers came home with injuries, disabilities, and mental issues like PTSD that the government offered them absolutely no assistance with, making the Gulf War no different from any other war. But anyway, what made the Gulf War so unique is soldiers who were unfortunate enough to go oil sniffing in the rear end of Basra and kick rocks in the Iraqi deserts came home with a whole new mystery illness that confused doctors for many, many years. And it seemed, again, just like with any other war, that the government knew a lot more about this illness than they were willing to share. This illness became known as Gulf War Syndrome.
Так, мотаем. Мотаем рекламу тоже. Хотя не, реклама смешная.
Сегодня наш спонсор Фьюм.
Allow me to sing you its tune.
Давай, родной.
Here's flavored air that you can savor with no bad chemicals or vapor. Once you get it, you'll be over the moon. With a metal base and nice
Пацаны,
finish,
купите себе металлическую письку с запахом кала.
And there's a black licorice if you so wish. Over 300,000 will say that sucking on fume is surely the way. So grab your fume from its base, enjoy that crispy mint taste. And bad habits shan't be here to stay.
Борись с вредными привычками, соси пенис.
Right away. Enter code
с презервативами самых разных вкусов.
But if the link is not your scene, scan the QR code on the screen. Get a free base.
Как же охуенно. И ведь кто-то же это писал, и это не Данкула был, нихуя, какой-то чувак в фуме такой... Бля, надо, короче, чтобы чувак, известный тем, что заставил мопса зиговать, нужно, чтобы он песенку спел про наш фюм. А потом легко и просто выиграть из аквабокса. Спасибо, Петрович, сейчас поставлю.
Now, I don't know if I really need to give much background on the first Gulf War, seeing as everybody watching this video has probably grown up with its more famous sequel trilogy, The War on Terror. Spoiler alert, we fucking lost, but basically...
Есть такое, как там, американцы любят объявлять войны абстрактным концепциям и потом проигрывать их. Война с терроризмом, война с наркотиками, война с бедностью.
All you need to know is this Saddam guy, well, he's got a villain-coded mustache, he loves killing Iranians with gas, and he just attacked Kuwait. And guess what? Kuwait loves America. And if there is one thing that America loves, it's a simp nation located right next to one of their enemies. And if there is another thing America loves, it's an excuse. So, as a result of this, for no morally dubious reasons at all that you definitely shouldn't read into, NATO was fully mobilized on the Saudi border.
Ну как,
and
с первой войной в заливе это более-менее все понятно, но серьезно, нехуй было выебываться на Кувейт.
proceeded to invade Iraq, performing essentially a blitzkrieg throughout the desert, all in the aim of rescuing Princess Kuwait from the evil clutches of Emperor Saddam Dorf and
Инстанс тайм-кода 2,5 минуты.
Так, ща. Возвращаемся к войне в заливе.
NATO was fully mobilized on the Saudi border and then proceeded to invade Iraq, performing essentially a blitzkrieg throughout the desert, all in the aim of rescuing Princess Kuwait from the evil clutches of Emperor Saddam Dorf and liberating Iraq with freedom, cheeseburgers, and that black-green colour combo-edgy new metal aesthetic that was in chic for over a decade. Trust me, there were
Ну, кстати, да, тогда же примерно Матрица вышла.
no other Cassius bellies that were needed, and any other reports of things
Какие нахуй Кассиусы Белли? Машина, ты чё несешь?
that may have influenced the need to go into the desert is complete conjecture spewed by conspiracy theorist misinformation merchants that are definitely evil and should not be trusted. The government has done no
Матрица
wrong,
99,
and if you go against the opinions of the government,
Включи перевод. Мы оцениваем клоунские качества оратора.
then you're crazy and an active threat to national security. OPEC have nothing to do with any of this, and you're unhinged.
Подождите, а что это за хуйня? Это дизайн? OPEC? О,
Anyway, let's get on to the war itself. The TLDR of our Sandy skirmish is... it was comically one-sided, with the Iraqi forces being unrepentantly mogged into submission within 100 hours of the operation's start by the
Орех.
completely overwhelming
Орес, нет, извините, Орес.
firepower and air superiority of the
Организация
coalition
Орес.
forces. This is despite the fact that the Iraqi army had the home field advantage and the numbers, of which they quite literally numbered in the millions.
Не помню, кстати, что конкретно там произошло, но они то ли быстро разбежались, то ли не были готовы к такому сопротивлению. Там, короче, была жесткая дизмораль.
Their rickety Dust Bunny T-72s might have been very good against an Iranian child conscript in the fields and
Да,
trenches
даже против иранских детей-призывников они что-то не очень работали, если честно.
Khuzestan, but sadly for the Iraqi Armoured Corps, they instead had to go mano-a-mano with the likes of the Abrams and Challengers. That is to say, they get folded like a fucking tea towel. But due to the fact that it is the Middle East, it very quickly devolved into an asymmetric quagmire, with militias and rogue units RDMing coalition chuds without advertising a raid. Fail RP. In other words, another day in the Middle East. But what we are focusing on today is those previously mentioned Basra oil sniffers. The troops, whom well deployed on bases and in operations during the war, started to notice things, like how a good chunk of their battle buddies were weirdly coming down with a mysterious illness that only started manifesting after returning home from deployments to the Durka Durka sandbox. After going through the stress, loss, and tragedy of sitting in a 40 degrees centigrade desert in full combat gear and getting shot at for a month, these unfortunate souls instead came home to suffer even more.
Да, бесконечное терпение, пацаны.
And I don't just mean reintegrating into Civvy Street. Our sufferers of interest started developing a wide variety of random symptoms without any real connecting factor. There were small things like fatigue, headaches, and insomnia to more particular and severe issues like memory problems, joint issues, broader neurological problems, and even tumours. It's fair to say that this wasn't ideal for anyone to experience, let alone returning vets who not only had to come home from a sweltering sandpit and reacclimate to running water and air conditioning, but also now having to deal with a nondescript physical illness on top of their debilitating psychological scars from partaking in the horrors of modern war. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, what in the goodness gracious caused this
Вообще, это
pestilence?
интересный вопрос. Насколько высокий уровень жизни в западных странах способствует появлению ПТСР в больших количествах? Или это просто проблема статистики в странах победнее, что они его не фиксируют?
To befall these sorrowful servicemen. How very well spoken of you. And I agree. What the fuck? So those eggheads up in R&D put that absurdly high budget to good use, and they started theorising as to the cause of the symptoms. Not out of care for the veterans who were suffering, but because the United States saw that the Iraqis were not getting this illness. Only coalition soldiers were getting it. So they were worried that this was possibly some new kind of chemical weapon being used to target their soldiers that they needed to watch
Называется местная кухня, биохимическое оружие.
out for. For the sake of thoroughness, we will go over the least likely and straight up dead ends that they hit first before getting into the real meat. The first theory that we're tackling is the oil fires. That Kino jarhead scene of the oil fields on fire, raining black shit down all over them was very, very cool. But it apparently caused Gulf War syndrome. Except, not really. Because despite the prevalence of asthma and bronchitis among those who breathed in that stinky air, the firefighters who were actually assigned to put out the fires, so the ones who were really in the thick of the flames and the fumes, didn't get Gulf War syndrome, despite being by far the most exposed to the fumes. So the oil fires definitely caused illnesses, but not Gulf War syndrome. Second theory. Vaccines.
О,
Ooh, that got you a little perked up. didn't it?
есть
But let me
такое,
have it. The Iraqi
да-да-да-да-да.
military had this nasty little tendency to put shit in their ordinances, things like missiles, munitions, etc. And one of the things that they preferred to spike their shells with was a fun little ailment called anthrax,
Охуенно.
alongside botulinum toxin. You could not only enjoy the experience of getting shelled by a howitzer, but also bask in the potential onset of botulism.
Да ладно,
Absolutely
ботулизм, сибирская язва, это ж пиздец.
riveting, I know, and the US military agreed. Thus, they, alongside other coalition forces, loaded up all of their soldiers on vaccines against such maladies. The only issue is that if you know anything about the US military, they tend to play it a little bit fast and loose with pharmaceuticals, usually giving those deployed gear that will work in the moment, but would also potentially fuck them up in the future. This was enough of a concern that they studied the vaccine post-war and postulated that those afflicted with Gulf War syndrome had antibodies in their system meant to fight off squalene, a compound supposedly found in the anthrax vaccine. The only issue was that upon closer investigation, it turns out that no, actually. The vaccines didn't actually have any
Скавины не обнаружили.
squalene in
Не обнаружены, окей.
them. So the vaccine theory kind of went nowhere. Another theory that they postulated is that they blamed all of it on stress. Yeah, seriously. You know that strange debilitating illness that you and your colleagues in uniform have all been suffering from for the past few years now? That's just all in your head, big guy.
You just have to chill out, man.
It's safe to say that this theory also went nowhere. One of the most popular theories was depleted uranium
Так,
being
было дело, да.
used in tank munitions, and the presence of certain pesticides and other such nasty Heisenberg shit in the air. What got them on the right track in the end was the realisation that indeed a lot of that Heisenberg shit bore vague similarities to the chemical and biological weapons. After all, it wasn't like the Iraqis were opposed to using such agents, they had used them before a bunch of times. See the Iraq-Iran prequel series and our fun little anthrax missile filler episode for more details on that. And let me tell you, that Iran-Iraq arc was a little bit fucking crazy. With
Есть
trench
такое.
warfare, child soldiers, and
Есть
yes,
такое.
chemical weapons. In
Чё там
steps
только
the
не было.
Regal Report, a 1994 dossier that basically claims that during the opening acts of the operation, whilst the scramble for air superiority was underway, apparently coalition forces were exposed to a constant stream of low-level, non-lethal doses from chemical and biological agents,
Так.
including sarin and mustard gas.
Охуенно.
Yeah, really,
А
sarin.
откуда она взялась?
Fucking sarin, the nerve agent that can kill a person instantly by essentially shutting down their entire nervous system just by taking a couple of breaths of it. Aye, the troops were exposed to all of that at very low levels, alongside fucking mustard gas like it was 1916.
Мустар-газ как из хот-догов? Нет, мустар-газ производят не какада авокадо.
All of the chemicals in
Но там, может, и хот-доги задействованы, да.
the air was in part due to the bombing of 34 separate facilities across Iraq, with those sites being 18 chemical facilities, 12 biological facilities, and
Охуенно.
4 nuclear facilities.
Охуенно. Потрясающе, блядь.
So all of that shit was flying up into the air, all mixing together into probably the worst ever chemical cocktail ever devised by mankind,
Да.
and was being breathed in by the soldiers.
Ну, это примерно как воевать в этих, возле какого-нибудь большого города в Индии. Там, переплывать ганг.
But it was diluted
Вы
in the
можете себе представить сложность форсирования ганга в случае теоретической войны Китая и Индии, например?
atmosphere enough
Это
to
же реально пиздец, блядь. Китайцев будет жалко. Они внутри себя начнут вынашивать коронавирус, им никакие летучие мыши не будут нужны.
not cause instant death, but very long-term health problems. One of the sites bombed that was well documented was a humble little patch of sand southeast of Baghdad called Qamishiyya. Qamishiyya was host to a munitions dump for the Iraqi military, creatively called the Tel Al-Lam Ammunition Storage Facility. It was a series of 88 bunkers. As the name suggests, it was a spot to stow away and store all of the ammunition that they had to use, which is something you never really think about. You know, logistics are everything in a war. And due to the nature of this installation, it was a prime target for coalition forces. If the enemy don't have bullets, they can't fight. Simple enough, really. Ammo stores are always a prime target. So, as a result, a detachment of combat engineers and a US EOD team is sent in to scope it out and completely level it. They meander in, they set up their gear, and they do their thing. They did it so well that it made a small mushroom cloud, which is pretty cool. I wonder why it's so dark and brooding. Unbeknownst to our Yankee wrecking crew, one of the bunkers, Bunker 73, actually housed missiles laced with, you guessed it, chemicals like sarin. So when the bunker got wiped, all of the munitions went with it. Suddenly, that massive stockpile of stinky missiles was atomized and the particles were airborne. With a gust of wind, it was diluted and dispersed across the country. You can see where it goes from here. Squaddies in the vicinity breathe in the manky air, bad things happen, repeat this across multiple sites in the country, and you've got a real phenomena at work. And since the Iraqi army and local civilians usually bailed the fuck out of those areas when the coalition troops rolled in, and the coalition troops were usually the ones closest to these sites because they were the ones blowing them up and then hanging around them after the explosion, that kind of explains how local Iraqi civilians and soldiers seem to just never get Gulf War syndrome, but the coalition soldiers did. So that might explain the mystery as to why it was only the coalition soldiers who were getting this illness. But it's not really on the coalition to a point, because it seems Iraq just fucking loved chemical agents. So it's not too surprising that that stuff would be all over the place.
У меня сейчас такие жесткие флешбеки с CNC-генералы. Ой, там и сибирская язва, и просто всякие токсины, и ракеты Скуд.
И
даже трактор.
A literal botulism bomb. And the American army did what it does best. They told the veterans, oh, we're sorry, but no, you can't file for military disability now. It's not our fault that the symptoms took years to show. Sorry, here's 2 paracetamol. And even... Sorry. And even to this day, Gulf War veterans are still suffering from this sickness. For some guys, their condition improved slightly, but for others, it just progressively got worse, to the point where psychological issues, self-harm and suicide rates amongst Gulf War veterans are much, much higher compared to veterans of other conflicts, because of the absolute smorgasbord of chemicals that they were all breathing in, completely destroying their bodies and their minds.
Вот так вот. Я до этого был осведомлен о гипотезе про объединенный уран. Но, видимо, его там было маловато. Так, окей. Ну шо, пацаны, развлекательно? По-моему, развлекательно. Учим шотландский английский. Но теперь у нас небольшой перерыв на гумозную хуету.